everyone. Welcome to this Roundup. Democracies have already been in distress. COVID-19 has further put the democracies on defensive. If the democratic institutions and governance model cannot show decisive leadership to manage the crisis like COVID-19 effectively, then the concerns of societal collapses increases. Now, each crisis tests governance models at all levels, both short-term and long-term. Now, while this pandemic is in the early stages, it is already testing nations' governance models and system. As a result, it is important to evaluate its effectiveness and if there is a need for change. To discuss the impact of COVID-19 on democracy, I'm delighted to welcome Professor David Mussington to this roundup. Dr. Mussington is a professor of the practice and director, Center for Public Policy and Private Enterprise, School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland, College Park, based in the United States. He is also an elected board member and member of ACM US Technology Policy Committee. Welcome, Professor Mussington. We are so honored to have you on this roundup.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Wonderful, Professor. So the COVID-19 rampage, it goes beyond human lives. It is destroying businesses, industries, economies, and even democracies. Now, as we see restrictions on civil liberties are becoming a new norm, where do you think the world is going with this?
I think different implications for different societies. I think it's interesting to see in the news that the assessment's already been made that some societies are doing better than others. In the United States, at least, our public health response is being challenged by many of the same governance deficits we saw previously. A lack of consensus on basic information, poor planning, poor execution, disputes between levels of government. I think those things are all characteristic of federalism in the US, and they've impaired our response to this crisis, and they continue to do so.
So how do you see this current crisis and the current way of operations evolving as we go forward? Do you see that this is going to bring the change in how the government operates permanently, not just in the United States, but across nations?
I mean, I do think there's lessons learned to be had already from the way different governments have addressed these problems. You can look at the response in Sweden as being one example of a perhaps less shelter in place, but still relatively successful response to spread of COVID. You can look at South Korea's success as perhaps the most salutary and welcome positive of a democracy successfully dealing with something. I think you're seeing societies creating different approaches to reconciling divergent objectives. On the one hand, civil liberties and openness. On the other hand, public safety and public security, public health. These do conflict, at least in the short run, in many societies, just given our different societal traditions. One could think of the individualism of the United States, where we insist on a limited government, where we hold government at bay, but it might be that the solutions we need require a different role for government. And I think that if you look across the US, you see different states have adopted different approaches. Certainly if you compare the state of New York, for example, to the state of Florida or the state of Georgia, you'll see an interventionist approach in the former and a much more laid back, decentralized, later set of responses in the latter southern states.
Yes, that is true. Now, as we see, coronavirus is highlighting the profound inequality that exists in our global society and between our states. I mean, you just give an example in how different states, had different approach and have a different approach in how they are dealing with this COVID-19 crisis. And yesterday I was looking at the news conference of Governor Cuomo in New York, and what came out very surprising was that the 60% of the new cases that are being hospitalized, they are coming from people that have stayed home, that are, maintaining the social distancing and all that. So again, the science is very fluid and the impact is very fluid, and we don't understand much how this is going and how it is infecting others. It is an airborne disease, right? And there are many things we still have to figure out, because this is a novel, new virus, and we are still learning about the virus. So every state and every decision maker is going with a different approach in how to deal with this virus to protect their community, to protect their citizens. But there is a lot that we still don't know.
I think
And
that's right. I do think there are things we do know, however. I mean, I think that we know that we don't have a vaccine.
yes,
We also know that we don't really have good therapies for dealing with the progress of the disease other than remdesivir, I guess was the latest one that was announced. And we also know that the shelter-in-place guidance that the CDC and others have advised has not cured this pandemic. It has simply changed the distribution and timing of infection for much of the public. So there are some facts that we know. We also know that the reason shelter-in-place seems to have flattened part of the pandemic is because it limits close human contact with people who are either asymptomatic or actually infected but not showing much symptoms at all. So those, from what we do know, there's some public health guidance that seems fairly uniform across societies, and that is,
yes, yes.
um,
But Professor, I was wondering this, that the last pandemic that we had, we approached the last pandemic just the same way, and we are approaching this pandemic, in also the same way. So my question is bigger, than this, that why have we not evolved in how to manage the pandemics? Yes, you are right that we don't have vaccines. Yes, we don't have therapeutic options, but there are, from my understanding now, there are many companies that are coming up with the trials of the vaccine. So yes, they are all working on it.
I
And
guess just in that case, I think that there are facts we know, but implications we don't.
yes,
So that we know about drugs that are going into trials, but we also know that usually it takes a year or more for therapies to go through complete human trials that respect human safety and security. So we can accelerate these trials and these therapy development processes only so much. My concern is less that. I think that can be accelerated because pharma knows what they're doing. My concern is the governments seem to have forgotten that they need to respect science in their responses, so that we are not adopting uniformly public health guidance. We're reopening the economy, for example, absent therapies, absent testing data, and absent a vaccine on the horizon, with predictable responses in terms of epidemiological insight that have predicted the shape and intensity of the damage. That those projections have been ignored. Those projections are the result of science, but the science is being displaced by politics or by fear or by prejudice, honestly, blaming the virus on some particular ethnicity or some other society in ways that actually impede an effective response. The real tragedy, I think, here is that we know better, but we're not able to actualize our knowledge in terms of better performance. So that's the crisis for government for me, which is we're unable to actually do as well as we know how to do.
yeah. I mean, I hear you on that, and there are a lot of questions that are going to emerge from that, and there are a lot of debates and discussions that will emerge, because of what is happening, not just in the United States, but across many countries. And democratic governance models are vulnerable to change. And as we see that any other form of governance, for instance, the authoritarian models, if they are able to manage the crisis more decisively, then there is also debate going to emerge that what is a better governance model for governments? Is it democracy or is it authoritarianism? Where in this kind of crisis challenges, what would be the best mode of governance? So there are a lot of questions and a lot of debates that are going to emerge from this. So do you see that COVID-19 disaster is a setback for democracy, not just for the United States,
Well,
broadly speaking?
I think you can already see, and sort of more closer to my expertise in terms of disinformation and cybersecurity, you can already see governments contending with each other over trying to lay blame for the progress of the virus. The accusations that China concealed early information about the nature of infection, et cetera, is just about distributing blame and reputational damage to other actors with whom you compete. So China and the United States, at least the administration, are now blaming each other for the progress of the pandemic, rather than choosing a different path, which would be international collaboration to suppress the virus. So that's not over, and in a sense, we're living a long experiment where the democracies and authoritarian states, as you've stated, have a public debate and a political debate over who's performing better. The competition between China, for example, and the United States in terms of world order can't help but be affected by these trends. China does seem, at least at first blush, to have done a much better job of bouncing back economically than we are. That judgment may change over time as we learn more about what's happened there. But initially, yes, it looks like one model of governance to a third party, an interested third party, might seem to be doing better on this. That may not be the judgment in 6 months, but that's 6 months from now.
Yeah, yeah, we all see that, and the visible battle that we are witnessing between authoritarianism and democracies, I think will probably likely intensify, and it will shape the minds of many people based on who is more effective in navigating their respective nations through such, existential crisis like having a pandemic of this proportion. So,
I do think there is one set of realities that aren't much reported, and I think that they don't clarify much, but they do add richness to the discussion, which is the performance of subnational governments, states, local governments, public health authorities, not just in the United States, but then in other countries, that is much better than the national government level. So I look at the state where I live, Virginia, Maryland, California, and others, where governors, democratically elected leaders, are doing much better in terms of showing mastery and control, leveraging their governmental resources to respond to their crisis in their jurisdictions. That same more salutary, more satisfying, I suppose, perspective is possible in other countries. I look in my old province of Ontario. I originally came from Canada. Ontario, Quebec, British Columbia are all doing much better than larger governments. Now, the Canadian government's doing fairly well as well, but there is an interior story inside democracies that is a little bit less despairing, I suppose. Now, they aren't national governments, so they maybe can't have the total effectiveness than they should, but the notion that democracies are each national experiments where popular government gets to deal with challenges in different ways, and sometimes you're more successful, sometimes you're less, didn't end with COVID-19. And I look at, there are some states in the United States that did anticipate the progress of the pandemic and did organize the resources as they could to meet the challenges facing their citizens. And some states are doing better as a result.
Yes, I mean, we all can see that you are right about it, but at the same time, the barometer, the mark that everybody is watching very closely is how many people are dying. Sure. And that is a question that is going to haunt, many states and many countries, because...
No, I agree. The numbers tell the story, and they're frightening.
Yes, yes. Yeah. Very true. Number tells the story, and especially when we see over half of the humanity is in lockdown right now. I mean, we are not talking only about United States, all over the world. And in democratic countries, we are witnessing that the freedoms that have taken the greatest toll are those related to the free movement of individuals, and and not many people can get together, assemblies and all that. So there are also states like Texas, where people love freedom, and they do not like to be told what to do and when to close down and things like that. So there are also a lot of people, raising questions that did the democratic process follow when democracies decided to cut the freedom? Because today they told that, okay, nobody can go out. Tomorrow they will say that you can do jobs, you will have no earning, wages, you will have no earnings, you don't have enough money to feed the families. If you see in India, there are, all of a sudden the country went in shutdown, and there were millions of laborers that got stranded. There were no buses, no transportation. Everybody had to walk to their homes, home states. There were hundreds of miles, and a lot of people died during the process. So there are a lot of questions that are going to emerge from this, that, what should have been done? Because yes, you are trying to save lives, but at the same time, the number of people that got stranded, the number of people that are going to go hungry, and the number of businesses that will go bankrupt. So it is not just the number of people that will die, it is the impact this pandemic is going to have on the bankruptcies and hungers and famine, and those are also the bigger questions that are emerging. So are we following the democratic processes when we take the decisions like this to curb the freedom and entirely shut down the systems?
Oh, I think that there's always a tension in the democracies between, the public's welfare and the interests and preferences of individuals. We're seeing a very, very difficult version of that right now, and different democracies are dealing with it in different ways. I would say that it's necessary to differentiate between a failure of a system compared to a failure of a policy. These are different things, and I think of the system, just putting that argument aside for a second, it's quite clear that many democratic governments have done a very poor job of managing pandemic response. Not all the same, not all as bad as each other. Perhaps you have an extreme where Germany is in the good part of the curve and the US is in the less good part of the curve. Not sure. I think governments can do better. They can recover. Obviously, huge costs are being borne. I think there are, time will tell ultimately whether the system is in crisis because of the policy failures that we're seeing right now. I think that there's a whole set of broader international security impacts that are not being discussed right now that are likely to be as serious as the public health failures that we're seeing. For example, we're seeing China's explosive growth seem to stutter and maybe halt. The projections of China exceeding US GDP in 2, 3, 4 years may be missed now. The projections for international trade patterns to remain global with global supply chains, et cetera, all of that looks less sensible now than it looked a few years ago. So global supply chains and industry may change as well. I look at global travel and the functional bankruptcy of many of our airlines, not to mention our leisure cruise lines, et cetera. None of those business models look very sensible anymore. So huge tectonic shifts are coming in the global economy and national security. I put it to you that the ability of the United States, or rather the reputation of the United States for competence, for good government, for honest government, is on the line as well. Our performance is not only having human costs, enormous human costs, but it's costing us in terms of reputation for being an effective country, a leading country, a country that others should emulate. I think each of those things has been injured badly by our failure to come to grips with these challenges. In an international security environment, that introduces risks. Risks of the US's word not being trusted, risks of the US's capability and capacity to act being distrusted, and countries choosing to not go along with us when we assert facts and judgments in the way that they did in the past. Those are all going to interact with our economic sort of chaotic condition that we have to create a new world. And we don't know what that new world will look like other than one thing. We know it won't be a simple extension of what we knew. After all, 6 months ago, you could get on a plane and fly anywhere in a few hours and be anywhere and transact business and use your cell phone and the rest of it. All of that's been thrown in the air now. So yeah, the old familiarities, the old predictabilities, I think, are going to be transforming in front of our eyes. History, it doesn't always move in a linear, slow projection. Sometimes there's punctuated equilibria where things change dramatically, and we spend decades afterwards getting used to the new situation. So this era, for me, is analogous to the Great Depression, where huge social transformation, changes in values. For example, individuals' personal anxiety having economic consequences. Whenever I hear discussions about reopening the economy, I always think of people I know who don't want to leave their homes, let alone go to a restaurant or a movie theater or things like that. So basic human behaviors that are routine. I mean, for example, this June, I was supposed to be in Paris doing Paris Cyber Week. Well, guess when that was canceled? And my international travel for the next year is basically all been canceled. So that's David Mussington academic. For international business and just the way global society works, these are catastrophic times.
Yes, and I think that's where the challenges are, that in spite of making all these advances in science and technology, we are witnessing the collapse of all the systems because we want to prevent the spread of the virus. I mean, I'm sure that innovators can do better than this. We can come up with effective way of curbing the transmission of the virus than shutting down the entire society. And at the same time, we are also creating the cascading effect of this decision and
Well, I guess I'm not, I'm not sure that we actually have better ways rather than shutting down.
let me explain. For example, we have made great advances in AI. We have made great advances in Internet of Things and biosensor technology. If we had focused on developing technology to see where the outbreaks are emerging, then as soon as we would have found out that there is an outbreak in China Hubei region, we would have closed down that area, and we would have disinfected and shut down the entire system, and we would not have allowed millions of people travel everywhere and create this pandemic. That was possible, but the challenge is that we don't focus on the right problems to solve. So again, that's a topic of another discussion, that today's topic is about the democracy impact on the democratic institutions. But the point is that we have to innovate how we solve problems, and that because it seems so uh, old, that last pandemic we managed like this, and this pandemic also we are managing like this, and millions are going to die because of hunger and because of job losses. In India, there are 100 million plus people who have no jobs. In United States, we have 30 million plus that have no jobs or no income. How are they going to support and the trade has collapsed, the is entire supply chains are collapsing. We can surely do better than this, and especially now when we are seeing the impact of AI emerging. The AI, of course, the AI driven automation is going to accelerate the job losses in the coming years. So how are we going to manage the casualties, the cascading casualties in the coming years?
I think that at least a couple of things. First, I think that in order for AI or any of these new techniques that we have to have effective impact on the problems we face, we need good information. And one of the initial failures of pandemic response was that we didn't have good information. And that information that we did have, we didn't use it to make decisions. We used other information, prejudice, fear. We didn't use the information and the tools that some people wanted to use. Second, I think that anyone who served in government, and I've served in government a little bit, can tell you that AI and other advanced techniques aren't really being used by senior decision makers to make these decisions. Perhaps it is in the medical profession and public health, but not at the White House level. They aren't used. I mean, perhaps people suspect that this White House is not using those, but when I served in the White House under the last administration, first term, our decision-making patterns were substantially the same as they had been 25 or 30 years before. So the basic mechanisms of government, information processing to make better decisions, anticipating future threats and risks, aren't very good. They might be better in business. I think they are, because business confronts the economy and business conditions much more closely. So yeah, we're in crisis of methods, crisis of information. We don't know what the future will hold. I think that there's some things we can do to enable ourselves to deal better with the uncertainties we face. I think the uncertainties are still going to be there. For example, we do have an economy. You cited the unemployment figures. No doubt they're enormous, and they're going to get worse. I saw 3.7 million people added this morning who had been seeking unemployment insurance. 30 million people over the last 6 weeks. Clearly, short-term unemployment insurance is not going to be the way to support those people. Yet we are not able to make the political decision for some sort of permanent income support for people. We're still acting as if this is a short-term problem. Because we act that way, we'll spend a lot more resources before we ultimately come to a predictable conclusion, which is we have to support our people. For societies that are less wealthy than the US, the situation is dire. I agree. I have family in India. I'm aware of the realities that some people are confronting. And Yeah, information and wisdom and empathy are likely to help you more than a Darwinian approach, which is being adopted by some of our political leaders, basically deciding who's worth protecting and who isn't. I'm kind of a bit of a humanitarian, even though I'm a national security guy at heart. I mean, I think that better information and better systems, in a sense, collide with democratic consultation and deliberative um, inferences and narrative.
Yes. No,
Many of these things, we need to make decisions right away, but we
yes.
don't have consensus on what to do. So that's a uniquely democratic, democratic political situation.
Yes, and I think you made a good point about the decision-making process, that yes, governments are behind in the decision-making process in how they make decision. The system is not that matured as, mature as the businesses are,
Let
mature.
alone the scientific community, which
That's
is also much better.
Yes, that's a good point. But at the same time, I also see, I mean, look at the state of our country. The political divide is enormous. I mean, the ideology has created almost like a segregated society. And that is very unfortunate because, the minds are so drawn about how certain things should be that there is no room for, coming together. And that is a shame that we, right now, we are facing those challenges even to manage the pandemic. The political divide is so enormous, and even before this crisis the dissatisfaction with democracy has been on the rise in many regions, not just
Agreed.
one country, but many
Yeah.
regions.
I think economic changes in the last 10 or 15 years have driven that, where many of the gains of our economic growth seem to go to people who are at the top of the social economic ladder, and the people at the bottom tend to either fall into the gig economy or just fall out of the system entirely. I think that's an overstatement, by the way. but I think you're right. When people see that their lives and the lives of their children and their relatives are likely to be less good in the future, it makes them ask basic questions about the
Yes.
societies they live in. And I think that the democracies confront that more directly. It might be that there's a parallel process in authoritarian regimes where their legitimacy becomes undermined by a continuation or emergence of bad economic performance, but we don't know that. So for democracies, yes, that is a crisis, I'll agree. On the partisan divide in the United States and perhaps in some other societies as well, I guess I have a slightly different take. I mean, I think there is a partisan divide, no doubt, undeniable. Some of that partisan divide is because of previously um, lower participating groups in the last decade have started to participate more and are no longer acting in silence. I mean, I think of, obviously, I proudly served in Barack Obama's administration, so full disclosure on my biases. But the representation of groups that used to not be part of the national conversation has elicited a response by others that looks to some like partisan division. To others, that looks like a clash of worldviews between groups that share an American nationality or a common national heritage, but differ on who should get to speak. And that's America. We're not hopefully going to get over that one. I think that it also coincides with political parties where, to be frank, one of the parties has decided that it's not interested in that broader national conversation. The other party has decided differently, and those two communities fundamentally disagree. Interestingly, they disagree on the factual basis for pandemic response as well, where one side is much more science driven, I think, and the other side is you saw, I'm sure, the armed people in the Michigan State House with the AR-15s on their backs, or people yelling in each other's faces and attacking people who wear protective masks. That's not a partisan issue. That is wow, what kind of issue is that? I'm not even sure how to characterize it.
No, I mean, there are huge challenges, no doubt about that. But at the same time, we also have to think deep down that are these ideologies outdated? Because I think, the challenges that we are facing as a society, the challenges that are coming our way are so huge that we will have to come together if we want to solve those problems for the future of humanity. Otherwise we'll see society collapsing as we move forward. This pandemic is just the beginning, but where we are going with the AI driven automation that will bring the lot of economic disparities, there are going to be enormous challenges coming our way. So unless we are able to work together, we won't be able to solve problems. And I think both the parties' ideologies are outdated. So we need to
I,
work on that. We need to come up with effective understanding of what are we fighting for. I think we all are fighting for the same thing, to protect our rights, to protect our future, to
so
protect.
I think that's true for some. I think some are seeking to step back in time to an era where that they feel was better. Some are nostalgic for a past where the challenges seem more manageable and where people they now blame for society's failures were less visible. I think that there's a nostalgic part of it, part of some people's ideology that searches for that. I think the opposite of that is the appeal of science and rationality and logic, that the future can be better than the past if we expand participation and visions of the future, which aren't all Western and aren't all American, and that we just allow people to participate in the definition of what the way they'll live in the future. And that means making economic decisions and political decisions to elaborate on that vision. It doesn't mean, for example, a simple acceptance of policy prescriptions that have not delivered in the past. So if we, for example, decide that a pandemic response requires that the economy really be shut down for many more months, if we decide that, then we need to follow the thread of logic. That means, what else do we need to do to make that sustainable? Because if it isn't sustainable, people will rebel, because people will see the future as being worse than the past, and they will not agree to participate. So we owe it to the public, especially to democratic publics, to show a plan, some sort of plan, and we need to say how uncertain, we need to admit the uncertainties that we haven't resolved, but we need to commit to resolving them using the best tools, AI, information,
Exactly.
elite judgment, expert judgment that we have, and we need to state up front that that's our approach. I think that if we did that, people might have more patience. People might have more, and democracies might face less of a crisis that you correctly recognize that we face. So telling the truth, applying the best reasoning that we have, but showing empathy for those who are bearing the brunt of the costs that we perhaps have to bear. And that means on unemployment, for example, not telling people that they are not going to have income in 3 weeks, and not telling people that, by the way, they're losing their health care too. I mean, we can't say we're going to get through this and then abandon the least among us because we don't think that we can afford to take care of them. These are our society. We owe them a debt of common feeling. We're all in this together. That should be the vision we have. I think in the best of approaches to dealing with our current challenges, we need to apply our best judgments, our best science, our best resources to the task.
Yes.
Now, the difficult part of this might be that those resources are controlled by people who don't want to use them in the way that best scientific judgments would state. And I'm not quite sure what to do about that. And here I'm citing, those who think the economy needs to reopen have a fairly strong difference of opinion with those who think that they understand the pandemic's dynamics. And I think, at least the public health opinion I'm hearing, doesn't tell me that it's safe to completely reopen the economy absent a lot more testing and some sort of therapies or a vaccine. Yet we have governments that are kind of doing what we did back in 1918, reopening the economy before we have really gotten a handle on the control of the pandemic. That has predictable consequences, which we'll have to deal with if we follow that set of judgments that are divorced from science. So the path before us is one of choice. We have to choose whether we adopt a rational, empathy-laden, scientific referring response, or we adopt a political and economic response which won't meet public health requirements. We really do need to privilege the science here, in my opinion. And
Yes,
if we don't, well, the cost will be borne, unfortunately, unevenly by those who are poorest, who have health challenges, who just don't have access to power.
do you see that we are missing the objectivity in the decision making process, and as we move towards AI driven automation and as governments adopt these decision making technologies of AI, that we would see more objective decision making happening? And if though when we move towards that, I mean, right now we are seeing Hungarian leader, Viktor Orban. He recently approved a decree by his nation's parliament that gives him broad powers to rule the country. Now, as we move, it's not just the pandemic, as we move forward with the AI driven automation and decision making, and we adopt those tools and technology to do the decision making for the governments, do you see that the democracy will be able to survive and that we will not move towards greater authoritarianism?
Well, I mean, I think the democracy will survive, but I think the balance between executive authority and legislatures may change. If we favor expertise, I don't know the Orban pronouncement very well, but he has a reputation for being somewhat more authoritarian than some other democracies. If we think that sounds like executive freedom of action to me. If that's leveraging artificial intelligence insights, and I don't mean current level artificial intelligence, I mean some sort of future artificial intelligence that's better, maybe strong AI, then that's better judgment, not necessarily more democratic judgment. And that would be in sync with a shift from participatory democracy towards executive latitude of judgment. It can still be democratic. It just won't be democracy as we currently know it. And there are always political debates between the power of the executive and the power of the legislative or judicial branches of government in the United States. So I think that we're going to see a shift towards enhanced executive power, but unless that is, the executive is judged to be not competent. And the 2020 election will make that judgment in one way or another. But more generally, if we go to expertise, to artificial intelligence based on better information and better information processing, there's no reason to think that necessarily favors democracies. After all, who controls the AI? Who controls the information and access to the information? Is it those who run economically important companies, government, etc.? If they do, you're right back to favoring executive power over legislative or participatory assemblies and democratic legislatures. I'm not sure what the way out is of that. If the executive is still responsible to a democratic public, maybe that's enough. But AI isn't necessarily democracy favoring. Why should it be? It's intelligence. Is more knowledge in sync with the likely decisions a democratic polity would favor? For example, we have political consensus on all sorts of issues that show opinion, prejudice, belief, faith.
Yes.
Those don't resolve back to artificial intelligence reasoning. Well, there's no reason to think they would, anyway. If we choose to push those aside in favor of artificial intelligence and more sophisticated decision-making procedures that I may approve of, I might think we get better public outcomes in terms of policy. In fact, I probably do think that. I may think that's democratic, because as long as our executive power is responsible to the electorate in some way, that's okay. There's a broad spectrum of democratic accountability between a strong executive, which is nationally elected every 4 years, and a Congress that's elected every 2, and states that are elected in off years where you have hundreds of thousands of elected officials making consequential decisions. So AI has impacts at each of those levels. There's no reason to think it's legislative friendly. Might be executive friendly, especially executives that claim special knowledge and insight that they don't share with other people. Envision, for example, a future 15, 20 years from now where we have another pandemic like this one, where
let's hope that we don't have that.
Hopefully not.
Our last pandemic, and we don't see anymore.
Exactly. But imagine an environment where the executive has artificial intelligence models that suggest the path of the disease and suggest patterns of infection and suggest that it's necessary to act right away to solve this problem. And then envision communicating those insights to a public that doesn't know science, that's less well educated about science, but still has prejudices about how pandemics work and how a pandemic started. Converging those two things is always going to involve friction and controversy. And AI doesn't get you out of that if you're a unless you're an authoritarian, in which case you use force. But if you're a democratic state, you confront the requirement to explain and convince. And explaining AI insights to the public isn't going to be easy. It'll require work. And it'll require defense effects and rigor against prejudice and demagoguery and rhetoric and hate mongers and disinformation and the rest.
Yes, of course. I mean, there are going to be challenges. It's not going to be an easy transition, but I believe that AI will, if we design and define the algorithm objectively, without that there are no biases getting into the algorithm, then I think we will get a lot more objectivity in decision-making process.
I guess that's true, but how do we do that? I mean, I look at some people at my university who work on algorithm bias in home lending, in just information processing to do things like facial recognition. And these are, and I look at the relationship between algorithmic development and test data sets, which often incarnate bias because of data collection issues and methodologies. And, you know, I don't think that AI is necessarily going to reproduce the biases of its creators, but I think it'll take some work to make sure that it doesn't. I don't think that it naturally will give us, you know, it may give us more effective decision-making, don't get me wrong. It may not give us more democratic decision-making. By democratic, I mean an informed public making individual calculations of value and risk that are informed by the best information available, that collects into a national position on a particular decision or judgment or policy. I don't think that's artificial intelligence. That's called legislative democracy.
No, you made a good point. And yes, there are a lot of questions that we still need to answer. We still need to figure out how to remove the biases from those algorithms. And it's going to be work of its own. You know, there is a long way we have to go before we bring the objectivity in the algorithm, so there are no biases involved in the decision-making process. But I'm confident that we'll be able to reach there. And, you know, because...
No, and I hope you are right. I really do, because I think that I tend to be an optimist when it comes to science and engineering, and I think generally speaking it delivers more benefit than cost.
Yes.
But it doesn't do that if it's not directed. It doesn't do that naturally any more than it naturally does the opposite. I think that we need to have some values that govern the kind of AI that we say we want. And that means if we want AI that doesn't duplicate the prejudices and decision-making
of course.
of the past, but we need to ask for that.
Absolutely.
And the people asking for that often are democratic leaders.
Yeah, otherwise, what's the point of, you know, automating all those decision-making process if we are going to just replicate the challenges that we are facing in the society now?
Great, but
there's no point of that.
But on the other hand, if I run a private business, I might want to deploy artificial intelligence to make more money. Right?
No, I hear you. I mean, we will have to make sure that the algorithms are not biased and that we don't carry the challenges, you know, that we are facing in the society now, and then multiply it, you know, numerous fold, because, you know, algorithm, we won't be able to control it that much, you know.
Yeah, but I think that there's I look at my own students and I look at the university where I am in a school of public policy, and I look at the difference in methods between the business school, where we share a building, and the public policy course content and the expertise, education that I have. I'm a political scientist, economist, and I look at the sophistication in the engineering school and our computer science and mathematics department, and the real deficit in methods and timeliness of social scientists like me versus engineers and mathematicians, etc. I'm concerned that we need to keep up or catch up again in the social science domain, because we won't actually understand the dilemmas that artificial intelligence poses. And I think that's one of the problems we have right now, that government's going to be surprised by how good AI insights are sooner rather than later. And when they're surprised, they're going to deny the validity of the insight. I mean, I don't think that they'll just say, of course, we must take advice from our AI guidance. I don't think that's what they'll do. I think first they'll deny it. In fact, they'll sort of go through the phases of denial. Sort of, they'll argue with it, they'll bargain, they'll be depressed, and then they'll accept. I think that sort of 3 or 4 phase process is how governments, let alone democratic governments, confront dramatic change. And I think AI has the potential to pose that kind of change. So that we need to get ready. I look at my students and I think of how many of them are mid-career, 20s and 30s, that are retraining on science and data science in order to catch up. That makes me optimistic, actually, because it means that they're going to be able to ask the right questions when they face technological change, which is even more rapid than what we already confront. Our current leaders have had the great benefit, I suppose, of not having to make those decisions.
Yes.
They're, in a sense, we're in a transition period where we have leaders that barely use computers, don't understand smartphones, have never programmed a computer, and don't understand what big data and social media are. Our new leadership in the next decade or 2, 3 decades, my daughter's 14 in a few weeks, her generation, their awareness of these technologies and what they can do is transforming in terms of the potential we have in the future. So that part makes me optimistic. The transition from where we are to that world, however, we're not doing very well. Right, to be honest.
Yes, I mean, there are enormous challenges that we are facing, and we will have to use effective technologies to come to rescue, and we have to evolve our governance model, because there are a lot of things that technology will be able to do much better than what we humans are doing, because there is, as we see right now, there is so much divide and there is so much segregation, there is so much hatred towards each other just based on the political ideology. I mean, talk about religion and all those things, if you add all that, then there are enormous challenges, and we do need to come up with effective ways, effective tools, technologies, processes that we can bridge those divides. We can all come together as one human species, because right now we are all acting as tribes, and that is not a healthy way to live or healthy way to progress. And we have to look towards the future of the humanity. If we continue like this, then there are enormous risks coming our way. So there are huge challenges. So having said that, how would you like this democracy to move forward? Where do you see the challenges and what we need to do?
Well, I agree with the size of the challenge you present. I think that just going back to a remark I made a few minutes ago about not all governments are failing as catastrophically as our national governments are. I'm involved at the state level in Maryland in a civic initiative that joins universities together with civil society groups to organize based on information and based on informed conversation about problems and challenges that we face, to build consensus on solutions. It also builds trust. I think that is a necessary condition for us doing better. And obviously technology can facilitate those sorts of interactions. I look at the form we're using here, and I look at the potential for that to be a mass experience where basic insights, positive insights, fact-based insights are shared among people in a calm, hopefully calm, way that allows exchange free of rancor, and allows us to see the values we have in common as much as we have in opposition. That's maybe an old-fashioned view of civility in civic life. I think that many smaller communities in the US, in India, elsewhere, can still do that. And that's a hopeful thing. Enabling that through technology may be the best we can do. And that means expanding the circle of those involved that we think are like us, that have something of value to offer, using technology to build common bases of understanding of complex problems, and having a discussion about the solutions that will work. I'd go back to policy dilemmas we have: what to do about the pandemic, what to do about supporting people who are at heightened risk, the elderly, those who are immunocompromised, others. We owe a common set of responses to help people. That's, I think, a humanitarian ethic that I think many Americans, most Americans, feel. That's a belief I have. I think more than just Americans, many people feel that way. And I think a reasoned conversation from faith traditions, from an ethical tradition, just from a humanitarian position, at the community level. For me, it's the state of Maryland and Virginia. It's in that location. Scale, that may be scales to a country and to a world, and allows people to talk to each other as human beings more, and takes away the sort of veneers of prejudice and rancor that get in the way. It's quite clear that we can't respond collectively well unless we do that. I think technology, to the extent it can engage people on a common base of facts, common cares for family and for communities, might be the most optimistic thing that we have, especially if we can wed artificial intelligence and better information processing to that process. That would mean sort of a transformation of the public's ability to hold two contrary thoughts in its hands at the same time. One, that the collective interest needs to be advanced through consensus. And second, that the weakest among us are deserving of support. I think those two ideas are often in tension with each other. I think that dialogue is the only way, fundamentally. I know I may be an impatient person. In fact, I am. I'd like to do that faster than some other people I know. But I can't think of another way of doing this, since I don't want to leave other people behind. There are ideologies, unfortunately, that don't mind leaving groups behind as we adjust. I think that we can't afford to do that. Then again, I grew up in the UK and Canada. I'm now a public policy professor in the US, so that's probably me showing my background. But I really do think that that's the promise of science and outreach of the internet and forums like this, which is sharing of ideas, reasoned argument, consensus building, rinse, repeat, that process. That's what we're going to do. And technology can accelerate that process.
Yes, absolutely. And I think you put it very well that we cannot leave anyone behind. We are all one species, and we have to make sure that we all progress and develop, and we all have opportunities to grow. And there is no room for, biases, prejudices, hatred, or, any of those in our society now. Because if we continue living as a tribe, then the challenges that coming our way are so enormous. We have to think of this collectively, as you said, and we have to think of the future of our species. So thank you so much, Professor Mussington, for participating in Risk Roundup today.
You're welcome.
Appreciate your thoughtful insight on COVID-19 implications on democracy, and we also went towards a little bit of discussion on what is coming our way, AI, and I'm sure our global viewers and listeners would benefit tremendously from the information you provided today. And as a result, this Risk Roundup dialogue has been of service. We thank you for that.
Thank you.
So Risk Group is a strategic security risk research platform and community. And our ecosystem is the first and only cross-disciplinary and collective community that is made of top scientists, security professionals, thought leaders, entrepreneurs, philanthropists, policymakers, and academic institutions from across nations collaborating to research, review, rate, and report strategic security risk to protect the future of humanity. Add your voice to risk groups. Get involved to protect the future of humanity. Until next time, I'm Jayashree, host of Risk Roundup, signing off. See you next time. Thank you.